And that is the reason why our voice against terrorism, to alert the world about this evil, rings with seriousness and outrage. We believe that this is one of the biggest challenges, not for any single country, but for the entire world and humanity. The lack of unanimity amongst us on the issue of terrorism dents those very principles that are the basis for the creation of the UN. And that is why, for the sake of humanity, terrorism, and that the world stands as one against terrorism. Mr. President, the face of the world is changing today. Modern technology in the 21st century is bringing about sweeping changes in social life, personal life, economy, security, connectivity, and in international relations cells within our boundaries. In this new era, we will have to give new direction to multilateralism and to the United Nations. We will need to give it new strength. Mr. President, 125 years ago, the great spiritual guru, Swami Vivekananda, gave this message to the world during the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, right here in America. The message was harmony and peace, and not dissension. Today, the message from the world's largest democracy for the international community is still the same: harmony and peace. Thank you all very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I would like to thank His Excellency the Prime Minister of India for his address. I would ask protocol to please escort him.
La Asamblea escuchará.
The Assembly will now hear an address by the Prime Minister of the Republic of Singapore. I ask protocol to escort His Excellency.
Tengo el gran placer de dar.
It is my great pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister of the Republic of Singapore, His Excellency Lee Hsien Loong. I invite him to address the General Assembly.
As we approach the 75th anniversary of the United Nations next year, it's timely to reflect on the role of the UN and the relevance of multilateralism. The open and integrated international order that emerged after the Cold War has benefited all countries. For small countries like Singapore, multilateral institutions, systems, and laws are critical for our survival. These give us a stake in the global commons and a means to defend and to advance our interests. A rules-based system imposes responsibilities on all countries and creates a stable environment for all. And this is why Singapore is a staunch advocate of the United Nations, of international law, and of the multilateral system. Now the world is going through a complex transition. The strategic balance is shifting. More countries are keen to enhance their international roles and are competing fiercely for influence. At the same time, the global consensus on the benefits of globalization has eroded, and support for multilateralism has declined. In many countries, nationalist, isolationist, and protectionist sentiments have intensified. These sentiments have reshaped their domestic politics and given rise to inward-looking nativist policies, and the result is a more polarized world. Continuing along this path will lead to an even more fragmented and unstable world. And yet, despite the increased friction and greater potential for conflict, countries have, in fact, become much more interconnected. Actions by one country are having a greater and faster impact on others, and effects that may eventually redound upon themselves. In such a world, a multilateral approach is not an option, but a necessity to deal with complex global problems, including poverty eradication, pandemics, and climate change. These are some of the themes of this year's UN General Assembly debate. Sustainable development has become a priority for all countries. We all face common challenges: creating jobs, raising standards of living, and eradicating poverty. But it is very difficult for any country to develop and progress on its own. Growth requires trade, investments, and technology. And all of these activities depend on working with others within an open and orderly international framework of rules. And that has been how many countries have progressed in the last 70 years, since World War II. Developed countries opened up their own markets. In return, they benefited from access to new markets in the developing world for their industrial products, such as aircraft, electronic devices, and machine tools. China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001 presaged 2 decades of dramatic economic growth, which lifted more than 850 million people out of poverty. India, too, has grown steadily since the 1990s as its economy gradually liberalized and became more enmeshed with its partners. Earlier, other smaller economies in East and Southeast Asia, including Singapore, traveled this same path. Now, many developing countries in Africa and Latin America are making the same journey. But if global markets become less open and conditions for trade and investment become more uncertain and disorderly, their progress will become much harder. Traditionally, developed countries help developing countries through foreign aid and technical assistance. But a much more effective way to help them is for developed countries to keep trade and markets open so that developing countries become more productive and can uplift standards of living on their own, providing good jobs at home without the pressure to emigrate to seek better lives elsewhere. Today, there's a strong pushback against an open, integrated global economy. The view that globalization and free trade have worsened inequality has grown. But in truth, globalization and free trade have improved the lives of billions of people around the world, and not only those living in poor countries. Indeed, within each country, there have been winners and losers, and not all countries have succeeded in squaring off the benefits and the costs of globalization domestically. Then, the international system often becomes their scapegoat. But a fragmented world with less growth and prosperity will create fewer jobs and make everyone's prospects even dimmer. Worse, closed global markets will create tension and instability in the international system. This does not mean the multilateral system is working perfectly. Far from it. The post-war multilateral institutions have serious weaknesses. For example, the WTO Trade Organization has found it increasingly difficult to reach meaningful trade agreements when any deal requires full consensus among its 164 member countries with hugely diverse interests and philosophies. Furthermore, The WTO's rules were designed for an agriculture and manufacturing-based world economy, and we now need new and better rules for services, particularly for digital services and intellectual property. But the solution should be to reform these institutions rather than to bypass or dispense with them, without first putting in place a better answer. However, countries cannot afford to wait indefinitely for these reforms either. Meanwhile, new regional mechanisms and frameworks for cooperation are emerging or have developed. For instance, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. These will lower barriers and raise standards for trade in goods and services. For finance, the Chiang Mai Initiative helps Asian countries to manage short-term liquidity problems via a multilateral currency swap arrangement and complements support from the IMF. These are practical ways for countries to work together to help one another through the vagaries of the global economy. Infrastructure development is another area ripe for regional cooperation. All over Asia, the demand for infrastructure far outstrips supply. Most of the time, governments can't fund all the infrastructure they need, and international financial institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank do not have enough resources to go around either. And that's why new initiatives like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, or the United States Build Act have a role and are welcomed by many countries. These regional or plurilateral arrangements may be second best to multilateral ones, but in an imperfect world, they address real needs and help us progress step by step. The key is to keep these arrangements open and inclusive so that the arrangements can overlap and add to one another and allow other countries to join when they are ready. We need to avoid creating rival economic blocs or a bifurcated global economy, forcing countries to choose sides and undermining the international order. Multilateral cooperation is also essential to deal with wicked global problems. These are problems that no single country can solve alone, but which, if not tackled, will have disastrous consequences for all countries. One salient example is climate change. This is an issue that our young people are seized with, and rightfully so, because it is about their futures during their lifetimes. This week, hundreds of thousands of young people demonstrated peacefully all over the world, including in Singapore, to demand climate action from their leaders. We owe them a responsibility to act, and they deserve our full support. On our part, Singapore takes climate change very seriously. Climate change is an existential issue for us. Like other low-lying island states, we are most vulnerable to rising sea levels. But we will suffer from its other effects too, whether it's new diseases, more extreme weather events, food shortages, forced migration, or even wars. Being so small, Singapore contributes only 0.11% of global CO2 emissions. Furthermore, we are disadvantaged in alternative energy with limited sources of renewables other than solar energy. Nevertheless, we are committed to do our full share under the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions and mitigate global warming. We've implemented significant measures, including a carbon tax, which is the first in Southeast Asia, and which we apply economy-wide with no exemptions. We are working with the United Nations to offer technical assistance to other countries. We will collaborate with partners to improve our understanding of climate change and its impact through research and institutions like the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center, which is based in Singapore. We will also contribute to efforts by international organizations such as the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization to reduce emissions. In this regard, I'd like to commend the UN Secretary General for convening the Climate Action Summit this week. It was both timely and necessary. Most importantly, we have to inculcate in our populations the mindset that each one of us has a responsibility to live sustainably and in harmony with the environment. We are under no illusions that the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming or less will be easy to achieve. And even if we do make it, the problem will not be completely solved, because that will only slow down the rise in sea levels, but will not stop it. But we must try our best, and over time, all countries will have to do more to mitigate climate change. At the same time, we must be serious about preparing early to adapt to climate change. Adaptation efforts will be costly, but they are an essential investment to protect not just our coastlines, but also our communities, our futures, and our very existence. It is the responsibility of our generation to leave future generations with a habitable planet, both through mitigation and adaptation. To adapt multilateralism for today's world calls for new approaches that are open, inclusive, and transparent. As member states of the United Nations, we all have to work together to find solutions to global problems and build support for multilateral institutions amongst our people. A rules-based multilateral system is still far preferable to any other way to secure our peace and prosperity and to solve global problems. I call on my fellow UN member states to support the multilateral approach, to push harder against the tide and demonstrate leadership in this endeavor. Thank you, Mr. President.
En nombre de la Asamblea General.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank His Excellency the Prime Minister of Singapore for the statement he just made, and may I request protocol to escort him.
La Asamblea escuchará.
On behalf of the Assembly, we will now hear a statement by His Excellency Marian Saric, Prime Minister of the Republic of Slovenia.
Tengo el gran placer
I have great pleasure in welcoming the Prime Minister of the Republic of Slovenia, whom I now invite to address the General Assembly.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct honor for me to address the United Nations General Assembly as a unique global forum in which all states have equal voice. The purpose of our annual debates each September is to assess the state of the world, identify trends and global challenges, and exchange ideas on possible solutions. Clearly, the world order is in transition and international organizations are trying to follow accordingly. However, in trying to adjust some of the shifting paradigms, it would be a grave mistake to abandon the fundamental principles that have guided us for past 3/4 of a century. These are the sovereign equality of all states, collective security, the progressive development of international law and the fulfillment of obligations in good faith, the peaceful resolution of disputes, friendly cooperation among states, and the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Respecting these fundamental principles under the umbrella of the United Nations prevents us from sliding into a state of global chaos and war. We live in an integrated world, one in which we all have a stake in each other's success. Our commitment to multilateralism derives from our values and a strong conviction that global issues can only be tackled collectively. Nationalism and populism produce catchy formulas with immediate appeal. However, finding genuine solutions to our problems tends to be complex and challenging, requiring a broader consensus. This is precisely why we are here, to look for solutions to global and regional problems through dialogue and with a mutual respect and diversity. This week, the vast majority of United Nations members once again reaffirmed their support for multilateralism. Mr. President, I wish to add Slovenia's voice to this call for effective multilateralism, more specifically focusing on three particular areas, namely the rule of law and human rights, climate change and SDGs, as well as the challenges related to new technologies. Regarding international law and the universality of human rights and fundamental freedoms, we must constantly bear in mind that for the system to work, every state must abide by and defend the rules-based order as is embodied in the UN Charter. Respecting international law is not a matter of opportunism or political will. It is a legal obligation and the sine qua non of the international system. Therefore, it is imperative to push back against attempts at undermining international law. A respect for international commitments and the implementation of international judicial decisions is fundamental. Over the past 7 decades, human rights protection has seen remarkable progress. However, this progress should never be taken for granted. We have to resist all attempts to weaken the existing human rights protection. This is one of the greatest assets we can and must pass down to our children. However, we must not only create opportunities for the young, but also appropriately address the aging of many societies and the rights of the elderly. Slovenia will continue to support the idea of a dedicated international legal instrument on the rights of older persons. The shrinking space for human rights activists around the world is alarming. All human rights belong to all people. Any identity-based discrimination and violence is utterly unacceptable. I say this also looking ahead to next year's 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. The important advances made in gender equality and the empowerment of women must be protected. Sexual and reproductive health and rights are among the cornerstones of gender equality. We must not forget that women's potential is still underutilized in too many countries. Mr. President, gross human rights violations tend to be early indicators of emerging conflicts. Hence, a swift and firm response to large-scale human rights violations is vital to prevent crises from developing into fully fledged conflicts. I therefore call on the United Nations Security Council members to uphold the Code of Conduct regarding mass atrocity situations and to refrain from using the veto in situations of mass atrocities. Slovenia is committed to conflict prevention and to mediation. Prevention reduces human suffering. We have seen it work. When we take early action and stand united, we save lives. My country is determined to contribute to prevention efforts, in particular by supporting the human rights pillar of the United Nations, international criminal justice, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. Specifically, Slovenia will continue to support the stability in and European integration of Western Balkans. While supporting their prospects for EU membership, we actively encourage regional cooperation, support regional reconciliation, and promote youth cooperation. Due to its strong deterrent effect, ensuring justice and accountability for violations of international humanitarian and human rights law is important from an ethical, legal, and practical perspective. As a member of the Secretary General's Circle of Leadership on Prevention of and Response to Sexual Exploitation and Abuse in United Nations operations, I wish to call for a concerted action to end sexual exploitation and abuse across the United Nations system. prevention and justice for survivors must be our first priority in this context. To assist states in holding perpetrators accountable, Slovenia, together with several other countries, has brought forward an initiative on negotiating a multilateral treaty for mutual legal assistance and extradition for domestic prosecution of the most serious international crimes. We thank all 69 states that have expressed their support for the initiative so far. We sincerely hope to obtain further support in the months leading up to the treaty negotiations, which begin next spring. Mr. President, I would also like to particularly address climate change and sustainable development. The climate crisis is evolving faster than predicted. By crossing several planetary boundaries, we have already taken away some of the resources that belong to future generations. The unprecedented mobilization of youth on a global scale that demands immediate action, followed by the Secretary General's initiative to convene the Climate Action Summit, has finally generated a sense of urgency. The COP25, held later this year in Chile, will be of critical relevance to humanity of our planet. We owe it to our children to not sidetrack from the Paris Agreement. We need to recognize the right to a healthy living environment. Climate change is a case in point for the need for effective multilateralism. The depletion of natural resources, in particular water, perpetuates the inequalities and risk of conflicts. It also forces us to rethink our current economic models and make them sustainable. The circular economic model, where resources are reduced, reused, and recycled, is inextricably linked to the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. For Slovenia, the transition to a sustainable and green economy is a strategic priority. Slovenia will continue to support the implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change. In this context, we will pay special attention to sustainable use and the management of natural resources, in particular water, the promotion of a circular economy, and the preservation and protection of biodiversity. In addition, Slovenia will continue to contribute to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda with a sense of urgency. It will present the progress made over the last 4 years in the second voluntary review at the high-level political forum on sustainable development in 2020. We need to make every effort to eliminate all forms of poverty and inequality, promote peaceful and inclusive societies, and mitigate the root causes of migration in developing countries. The issue of mass migration is neither a new challenge, nor can it be simply resolved overnight. It is an issue that should be addressed responsibly from the point of view of human rights and solidarity, with a clear focus on prevention, that is, by appropriately addressing the situation at its source. Mr. President, I believe we cannot have this important yearly discussion without acknowledging new technologies. Technological advancements bring people across the world closer to one another and to a greater extent than ever imagined. It provides immense benefits in terms of increased productivity and a higher quality of living, but also entails new risks to countries and individuals. People are increasingly reaping the benefits of artificial intelligence. According to estimates, as much as 80% of future work will be done by AI. It is bound to deeply affect the various facets of our daily life and fundamentally transform our societies. We need to be better prepared for a challenge of algocracy. which will include the regulation of the impact of AI on human rights protection. I am particularly pleased to announce the proposal to set up, with UNESCO's backing, Europe's first international artificial intelligence research center in the Slovenian capital of Ljubljana. The aim of the center will be to provide an open environment focusing on the governance and policies surrounding artificial intelligence. In this respect, I sincerely hope to be able to count on your valuable support at the upcoming UNESCO General Conference in November. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that at this critical time, we must go forward in the pursuit of our ideas and ideals, not abandon them. We need to give expression to our best hopes, not our deepest fears. We have to provide leadership that is strong enough to recognize that nations share common interests and people share universal principles and ideas in our common humanity. Thank you very much.
En nombre de la Asamblea General.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I would like to thank His Excellency, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Slovenia. May I request protocol to escort His Excellency?
La Asamblea escuchará
The Assembly will hear an address by the Prime Minister of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, His Excellency Imran Khan. May I request protocol to escort His Excellency? I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Prime Minister of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and I invite him to address the General Assembly.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Mr. President, Honorable Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I feel honored today to represent my country at this forum of world leaders, where we have a chance to discuss problems that the world is facing. I want to talk about a lot of problems, but just 4 today. And I especially came to this forum despite a difficult time in my country, facing challenges. I would not have come, but because I feel that there are some very urgent problems which the world must address. So first of all, I start with climate change. So many leaders have talked about climate change. But Mr. President, I feel that there is a lack of seriousness. Perhaps world leaders do not, some of the leaders who can do a lot, do not realize the urgency of the situation. We have a lot of ideas, but as someone said, ideas without funding is mere hallucination. Pakistan, I'll give you start with my own country. Our country is amongst the top 10 nations in the world which are most affected by climate change. We depend upon our rivers. We are mainly an agricultural country. And 80% of the water in our rivers comes from our glaciers. The glaciers, not just on the Pakistani side, even India. The river, the 80% of the water in Ganges and the Indian rivers also comes from the glaciers, from the Himalayan glaciers Karakoram, Hindu Kush. And these glaciers are melting at quite a rapid pace. We detected already 5,000 glacial lakes in our mountains. And if this keeps going, if nothing is done, we are scared that humans are facing a huge catastrophe. In my country, when my party came to power in the province of KP, we planted 1 billion trees in 5 years. Now we've set ourselves a target of 10 billion trees in Pakistan. Idea being to counter this, the effects of global warming. But one country cannot do anything. This has to be a combined effort of the world. My optimism comes from the fact that humans, the Almighty has endowed humans with great powers. We can do anything, provided our survival instinct is stirred up. And this is really what I hope that the United Nations will take a lead in this. There must be more emphasis. Richer countries must be pushed. Countries that are responsible for, mainly are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. They must be pushed because our country contributes minuscule amount to greenhouse gases. So I feel that the United Nations must take leadership in this. My second issue for me right now is even more critical. Mr. President, every year, billions of dollars leave the poorer countries and go towards rich countries. Billions of dollars siphoned off by the ruling elites of the developing world. And they find their way into Western bank accounts, offshore accounts, tax havens, expensive properties hidden behind companies bought in Western capitals. Mr. President, this is devastating the developing world. This is causing more poverty, debts. It's impoverishing the developing world. The difference between rich and poor countries is growing because of this. Money laundering, which happens because money leaves the poorer countries into rich countries, is not treated the same as, for instance, money from drugs or terror financing. The seriousness which terror financing and money from drugs, the way it is treated, it's not the same. The way the poor countries are being plundered by their elites. It's not happening. In my country, when I took charge of our government a year back, in the 10 years preceding that, our total debt went up 4 times. The debt we had accumulated in 60 years, just in 10 years, it went up 4 times. As a result, the total revenue we collected in 1 year, half of it went into debt servicing. How are we going to spend money on our human beings, 220 million people, when half the money is going into debt servicing? Because our country was plundered by the elites, the ruling elite. And easily they could get the money out. And when, Mr. President, we located properties in Western capitals bought by this money through corruption and money laundering, located the properties of these corrupt leaders, we find it so difficult to retrieve it. That money, if we retrieved that money, we could spend on our human beings. But it's so difficult. The laws protecting these criminals We do not have the sort of money to have expensive lawyers and spend millions and millions of dollars. We need help from the rich countries. And Mr. President, it's critical. The rich countries must show political will. They cannot allow this to happen. How can the poor countries spend money on human development, which the United Nations asks, SDG? How are we going to do it when this money can easily leave our countries? So, unless the rich countries intend to build walls to stop economic refugees coming as we see right now, they must take action. They must take action now. It must be a deterrent. Corrupt ruling elites should not be able to take money out easily and park it into foreign bank accounts and into these properties abroad. And I never understand why. Why do we have these tax havens? Why is this allowed? Why shouldn't rich people pay taxes? Why is it legal to have these tax havens where you have these secret accounts? Because, the world is changing. The population of the world is growing. Sooner or later, you're going to have a crisis. If the poor get poorer and the rich get richer, there is going to be a crisis sooner or later. So this is my second point. I hope that the United Nations takes a lead in this. It involves the IMF, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank. They must find a way of stopping this plunder of the developing world. My third point is Islamophobia. There are 1.3 billion Muslims in this world. There are millions of Muslims living in other countries, European countries, and the US as minorities. Islamophobia since 9/11 has grown at a pace where it is alarming. Human communities live together. There should be understanding amongst them. But Islamophobia is creating a division. Muslim women wearing hijab, it's become an issue. It's become an issue in some countries. Hijab is some sort of a weapon. A woman can take off her clothes in countries, but she can't put on more clothes. How is this happening? Because of Islamophobia. And how did this Islamophobia start? After 9/11. And why did it start? Because certain Western leaders equated terrorism with Islam. Islamic terrorism. Radical Islam. What is radical Islam? There is only one Islam, and that is the Islam we follow of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is no other Islam. Radical Islam, Islamic terrorism, what message did they send to people in the West? And why is there Islamophobia? How is a person in New York, in the Midwest, in the US, in European capital, how is he going to distinguish between who is a moderate Muslim and who's a radical Muslim? Because terrorism has nothing to do with any religion. This Islamic terrorism, Islamic radicalism, and sadly used by leaders, this has been the main reason for this Islamophobia. And it has caused pain amongst Muslims. We in Muslim countries watch this Islamophobia traveling abroad, and it's getting worse. And may I just say, Mr. President, that in European countries, it is marginalizing Muslim communities. And we all know that marginalization leads to radicalization. Some of the people who ended up as militants in Syria and other places were from marginalized Muslim communities. And my point here is that we must address this issue. I'm sad to say that we Muslim leaders have not addressed this issue either. After 9/11, when this thing came about war against radical Islam, rather than Muslim leaders trying to explain to the West that there is no such thing as radical Islam, in all human communities, they are radicals. They're liberals and rest are moderate. All human communities, Christians, Jews, everyone has it. But Islam is not radical, neither Judaism, neither Christianity, neither Hinduism. No religion preaches radicalism. The basis of all religion is compassion and justice, which differentiates us from the animal kingdom. But unfortunately, the Muslim leadership was so scared of being called radical Islam that all of them became moderates. In Pakistan, we were in the eye of the storm, and our government coined a phrase called enlightened moderation. No one knows what it meant. But everyone started putting on Western suits that they were moderates, started speaking. Even those who didn't know English would speak English because they were moderates. No one had a clue what it was. Because we, in the Muslim world, did not explain to the West that there is no such thing as radical Islam. One of the reasons why, after 9/11, Islam was supposed to be equated with terrorism was suicide attacks. Because the 9/11 bombers did a suicide attack, all sorts of theories came up that the Muslims are involved in suicide attacks because they will get virgin in heavens. Some came up with, what about women, suicide attackers? So this bizarre thing happened. No one explained. Suicide attacks and Islam were equated. No one did research that before 9/11, the majority of suicide attacks in the world were by Tamil tigers, who were Hindus. No one blamed Hinduism, and quite rightly. What has Hinduism got to do with what desperate people were doing in Sri Lanka? We all know we've seen films about Japanese kamikaze pilots at the end of the Second World War doing suicide attacks. No one blamed the religion. But here we were trying to prove we were moderates and not explaining to the West. But the most important thing I wanted to say here today, in explaining this Islamophobia, Mr. President, and I feel it's very important because I played professional sport in England, I spent a lot of time there. So I know how the Western mind works and how West views religion. So where the misunderstanding about Islam came. And one of the reasons it caused Islamophobia. That was, in 1989, this book was published, maligning, insulting, ridiculing our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there was a reaction in the Muslim world. The West couldn't understand what was the problem. Because in the West, because I have spent so much time in the West, religion is perceived completely differently. They don't look upon religion like we do. And so, Islam was supposed to be an intolerant religion. It was against freedom of expression. And Islam took a real beating 30 years ago. I still remember it became a watershed. And every 2 or 3 years, someone would malign our Prophet, peace be upon him. There would be a reaction by the Muslims. And again, it was Islam, an intolerant religion. Again, this time, I blame a certain section of the people in the West who deliberately provoked this, knowing the impact it would have. But the majority of the people in the West didn't understand. This is where, again, Muslim leadership let the Muslims down. We should have explained to them what our Prophet, peace be upon him, means to us. So in 1 minute, I'll try and explain what he means to us. Our Prophet was the witness to the divine book, the Holy Quran. The Holy Quran is the book of guidance for Muslims, and the Prophet's life was living the Quran. He was an example of what the Quran guided us to be. So he is the ideal we all try to get to. The Prophet created the state of Medina, the first state in Islam. That state was the basis of a Muslim civilization which became the predominant civilization for the next 700 years. And what was that state? I hear such strange things about Islam, that it is against women, it's against minorities. The first state of Islam in Medina, it was the first time a welfare state was set up. The state took responsibility of the weak, widows, orphans, poor people, handicapped. It taxed the rich, spent the money on the poor. The state announced that all human beings are children of Adam, hence equal, whatever the color of their skin. The state announced, the Prophet announced that, and slavery, the whole system depended on slavery as it did for many years in the Western societies. The Prophet said that one of the greatest deeds is to free a slave. But because the society depended on slavery, he said, but if you have to, treat them as an equal member of the family. And as a result, something happened in a Muslim world which hasn't happened in any other civilization. Slave dynasties appeared. Slaves became kings. The Mamluks, slaves who ruled Egypt. In India, there were slave dynasties. And then, with minorities, again, you hear that Islam is supposed to be against minorities. Let me just make this clear. In Islam, the Prophet announced that everyone was free to practice his religion. It was a sacred duty to protect the places of worship of all religions. He announced that every person is equal in front of law, whatever his religion or his color. And this incredible case, and I always quote this, that the fourth Khalifa, the head of state of Medina, he lost a court case against a Jewish citizen. So, number one, it showed there was a rule of law, no one was above law. And number two, that a Jewish citizen was an equal citizen. So, Mr. President, when a Muslim society is unjust to its minorities, it is going against the religion of Islam and our Prophet, peace be upon him. So, it is important to understand this. The Prophet lives in our hearts. When he's ridiculed, when he's insulted, it hurts. As we human beings understand one thing: the pain of the heart is far, far, far more hurtful than physical pain. And that's why the Muslims react. And I always thought that if I ever had the stage, I would try and explain this to the world community, especially to the Western community, because having lived in the Western community, people didn't understand this. When I first went as a teenager to England, there was a comedy film on Jesus Christ. It's unthinkable in Muslim societies. So we need to explain that, look, in a human community, we must be sensitive to what causes pain to other human beings. We have, in the Western society, and quite rightly, the Holocaust is treated with sensitivity because it gives the Jewish community pain. That's all we ask, that do not use freedom of speech to cause us pain by insulting our holy prophet. That's all we want. And now, the number 4th point, Mr. President, and this is the most critical point, is the reason why I especially came here. It is about what is happening in Kashmir. Before I go on this, I want to make one thing clear, that when we came to power, my first priority was that Pakistan would be a country which will try its best to bring peace. We had been through this war on terror. We joined the United States war on terror after 2001. And Pakistan went through one of its worst periods where 70,000 Pakistanis died and over 150 billion was lost to our economy. And Mr. President, I opposed the war because in the 80s, Pakistan had joined the Western countries in what was the freedom struggle then in Afghanistan against the Soviets. And it was funded by the Western countries. These Mujahideen groups, which were treated in guerrilla warfare, were trained by Pakistan Army, funded by the Western countries, and especially US, and they waged what was a freedom struggle in Afghanistan. The Soviets called them terrorists. We called them freedom fighters. 1989, the Soviets retreated. The Americans packed up and left. Pakistan was left with these groups. Come 9/11, Pakistan joined the United States in this war on terror. And now our government was supposed to, the reason why I opposed joining this war, because here we had indoctrinated them in jihad, meaning freedom struggle against foreign occupation. Now, because we had joined the US, and the US had occupied Afghanistan, now we were supposed to tell them that, no, this is not freedom struggle and jihad, it's terrorism. So that's why I tried to tell then government that, stay neutral because you will have leverage over them. You will be able to control them. But if you join them, you become collaborators and they will attack you, which is what happened. They turned against us. We went through a nightmare. 70,000 people killed in a war we had nothing to do with. No Pakistani was involved in 9/11. Taliban were in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan. What had we to do with it? 70,000 Pakistanis died. So when we came to power, we decided that we would dismantle what was left of these groups. And this decision was taken not just by us, but by all the political parties in Pakistan. Unfortunately, they didn't implement it. So we came to power, we decided to implement it, and we dismantled whatever was left of the groups. And I know that India keeps accusing us that there are these groups there. I would like the United Nations to send observers, see for themselves what we've done. No Pakistani government would have dared to do this because it would have created strife. But we decided that there would be no militant organizations in Pakistan. So I need to give you this background and to what I'm going to say later on. And secondly, we started mending fences. I invited the Afghan president. We developed a relationship with Afghanistan. We had problems with Iran. We mended fences there. and then India. Now let me just give you a little background about my relationship with India. Because of cricket, and cricket being it's a passion in the subcontinent, I had great following in India. I have friends in India, and I loved going to India. So immediately, when my party came to power, the first thing we did was to immediately reach out to India. And I spoke to President Modi, and I said, look, we have similar problems. Climate change, poverty, let's get together. Let's resolve our differences through trade. Let's build a relationship on trust. Prime Minister Modi told me that, there were terrorist attacks from Pakistan. I said, we have problems with you. There are terrorist attacks which we know are instigated by India in Balochistan. We caught a spy, Kulbhushan Yadav, who admitted what the sabotage going on in Karachi and Balochistan. So we said, look, let's leave that behind. Let's move forward. Our main priority should be our people. The highest number of poor people live in the Indian subcontinent. Unfortunately, didn't make any headways. Our foreign ministers were supposed to meet on this in the UNGA last year. India canceled it. We thought that it's their election coming up. It's a nationalist, ultra-nationalist party. It doesn't want to cozy up to Pakistan. So we thought, okay, we'll wait till the elections. Meanwhile, a 20-year-old Kashmiri boy, whose father said was radicalized by the security forces in Kashmir, blew himself up on an Indian convoy. Immediately, India blamed us. I spoke to the Indian public on television. I said, if you give us any iota of proof, we will immediately take action, because we've clamped down on these groups. Rather than sending us any proofs, they sent their jets in, they bombed us. We retaliated. Two of their planes were shot down, one pilot bailed out in Pakistan. We immediately returned the pilot, saying that, look, we do not want any escalation. Rather than taking that as a peace gesture, the entire campaign, almost the entire campaign of Mr. Modi in the election was how he had taught Pakistan a lesson that jets had killed 350 terrorists. Complete lie. They had just killed about 10 trees of ours, which was quite painful given that, we are growing all these trees. He then the election campaign, Mr. Modi used words like, this is just a trailer, the movie is about to start. I went into Pakistan and taught them a lesson. This was the election campaign. Okay, so we thought, us politicians make all these statements to win elections. So, okay, after elections, we'll get back to our normal relationship. Well, the moment the elections ended, we approached India, no response, but then we discovered they were trying to push us in the FATF blacklist to bankrupt us. That's when we realized there was an agenda. And that agenda became obvious on the 5th August when India went against 11 United Nations Security Council resolutions, which say that Kashmir is a disputed territory and the people of Kashmir have the right of self-determination. They went against that. They went against Simla Accord, which is about bilateral, sorting out our differences through bilateral means, went against that. They actually went against the Indian Constitution. Illegally, they revoked Article 370, which gave Kashmir the special status. They got an extra 180,000 troops there. Total number of security forces in Kashmir now are 900,000. And they put 8 million people of Kashmir under curfew. Mr. President, now I just briefly want to make the people understand, how can anyone do something like this? And for that, I have to explain to you what is RSS. RSS, Mr. Narendra Modi is a life member of RSS. RSS was an organization that was inspired by Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, came about in 1925. They believed in racial purity, racial superiority. They also believed they were an Aryan race like the Nazi believed they were an Aryan race. All that I'm saying can be verified. This is the time of information revolution. You can Google all this, what I'm saying. But it is very important for me to explain this to you so you know what is happening in India. This RSS believed in the ethnic cleansing of Muslims from India. At one point, there was racial superiority of the Hindu race. Secondly, it was hatred for the Muslims and for the Christians, because they believed that this golden age of Hindu civilization was stopped because of Muslim rule centuries back and then the British rule of India. So it was racial superiority and hatred for Muslims and Christians. This is openly stated. You look at the founding fathers of RSS, Golwalkar and Savarkar. Just Google them and you'll find out. And this ideology of hate is what murdered the great Mahatma Gandhi in 1948. It was this ideology of hate that made Narendra Modi in 2002 do a pogrom against Muslims in Gujarat when he was the chief minister. He allowed 3 days for these RSS goons who were inspired by the Hitler brown shirts. They actually wear brown shirts. This RSS, the Congress Home Minister gave a statement that in RSS camps, terrorists are being trained. And these terrorists butchered 2,000 Muslims and 150,000 Muslims were made homeless. Narendra Modi could not travel to the US because of that. And I need to make you understand this background before I explain to you that what sort of a mindset would lay siege to 8 million people with 900,000 troops. Women, children, sick people, locked in as animals. In fact, of what I know of England, if 8 million animals were locked in, the RSPCA would have made a lot of noise about it. These are human beings. And Mr. President, what comes with racial superiority, these illusions of Aryan superior race, is arrogance. The two go together. And it's arrogance that makes people make mistakes and do stupid things. Cruel things like what Narendra Modi has done. It's sheer arrogance. And it's arrogance that has blinded him from the fact that what is going to happen when the curfew is lifted? Has he thought about it? This hasn't been thought through. What is he going to do when he lifts the curfew? Does he think that people of Kashmir will quietly accept the status quo because India has changed the constitution and taken away the special status? They'll accept that? Mr. President, 100,000 Kashmiris have died in the past 30 years because they were denied the right given by the United Nations, the right for self-determination. 100,000 have died and 11,000 women have been raped. There are two United Nations human rights reports on this. The world hasn't done anything because India is a huge market, 1.2 billion people. Sadly, the material prevails over the human. But this has serious consequences. Again, I repeat, that's why I'm here. Look, what is going to happen when the curfew is lifted will be a bloodbath. The people will come out. There are 900,000 troops there. They haven't come to, as Narendra Modi says, he's done this for prosperity of Kashmir. This is supposed to be for the development. These 900,000 troops, what are they going to do when they come out? There'll be a bloodbath. Has he thought it through what happens then? Mr. President, has anyone thought that what happens when there is a bloodbath? What do you think the impact will have on people of Kashmir? What do you think they will think? The way they have been boxed in their houses, treated like worse than animals, no rights. Thousands of all the political leadership has been arrested, taken out of Kashmir. Even those Kashmiri leaders who were pro-India have been taken out. 13,000 boys have been picked up and taken to God knows which destinations. So what do they think? What will the people of Kashmir do when they lift the curfew? They will be out in the streets. And what will these soldiers do? They will shoot them. They've already used pellet guns, blinded young boys. In the last 6 years, the 5 years, the oppression that has gone on in Kashmir. And so, Kashmiris will be further radicalized. Mr. President, there will be another Pulwama. And guess what? India will blame us. They're already blaming us. They're saying all this is happening because of Pakistan. One of their defense ministers said, there are 500 terrorists lined up on the border to go in. Why would Pakistan send 500 terrorists when there are 900,000 troops? What impact are they going to make? What will they do? And why don't we know that the moment there is some terrorist attack, all that will happen is there'll be further cruelty and oppression of the people of Kashmir. We will just give the 900,000 troops to further crush the people of Kashmir. And then we'll give the Indian government an excuse that, look, Pakistan is a terrorist state, and this mantra that has gone on, Islamic terrorism. The moment you use this catchword, Islamic terrorism, the whole world turns away. No one talks about human rights. You can do whatever you want, which is what has happened in Kashmir, because they keep using this word, Islamic terrorism. And this is what they're doing right now. What do we benefit from further increasing the cruelty on the people of Kashmir? And why would we want this? But there is no other narrative left for India. As when they lift the curfew, whatever happens, Pakistan will be blamed, and there is always a danger of another Pulwama. They might come and bomb us again, and then another cycle might start. And what does Narendra Modi think? That 180 million Muslims of India are thinking right now. Aren't they watching these Kashmiris stuck inside for 55 days they've been stuck in? Aren't they watching? What do you think? Don't you think that the Muslims will be radicalized in India, and I'm talking about 180 million people. And when they get radicalized, there will be some incident in India somewhere down the line. Again, we will be blamed. And I'm warning you right now, again, we will be blamed. And Mr. President, what about 1.3 billion Muslims who are watching this? And they know that it is only happening in Kashmir because they're Kashmiri Muslims. This is not happening to Kashmiri Hindus. They know that this is happening because of their religion. So what do you think they will be thinking? What do you think the Jewish community would think if there were, forget 8 million, 8,000 Jews stuck like this? What do you think Europeans would think? What do we think? I mean, any human community, if their members are stuck like that, what do you think they will think? Are we a children of a lesser God? Is it not going to cause us pain? And then I'll tell you what will happen. People will, in the 1.3 billion Muslims, someone will pick up arms. I know we've been brought up with films, Western films. This good, decent guy doesn't get justice. He decides to pick up a gun and start seeking justice. There was a film made in New York, famous film called Death Wish. This guy gets mugged by and his family, his wife gets killed or something. He can't get justice. He picks up a gun and he goes around shooting muggers. And the whole cinema cheers him on. So what do you think the Muslims are thinking right now? If there is a bloodbath, there will be Muslims becoming radicals, not because of Islam, but because of what they will see, that there's no justice when it comes to Muslims. There were Rohingya Muslims, Myanmar, who are, God knows, almost 1 million people out, ethnic cleansing. What was the response of the world community? So what do you think will be the response of 1.3 billion Muslims? I picture myself. I'm in Kashmir. I've been locked up for 55 days. I have heard about, and there are rapes, Indian Army going into homes, soldiers. Would I want to live this humiliation? Would I want to live like that? I would pick up a gun. You're forcing people. You are forcing people into radicalization. When people lose the will to live, what is there to live for? And this is what, if you can do this to human beings, you are actually radicalizing people. And so, Mr. President, I want to repeat here, this is one of the most critical times. There will be a reaction to this. Pakistan will be blamed. 2 nuclear-armed countries will come face to face like we came in February. And before we head in that direction, the United Nations has a responsibility. This is why the United Nations came into being in 1945. You were supposed to stop this happening. I feel we are back to 1939, Munich. Czechoslovakia has been taken, annexed. What is the world community going to do? Is it going to appease a market of 1.2 billion, or is it going to stand up for justice and humanity? If this goes wrong, you hope for the best, but be prepared for the worst. if a conventional war starts between the two countries, Mr. President, if a conventional war starts, and anything could happen, but supposing a country 7 times smaller than its neighbor is faced with the choice, either you surrender or you fight for your freedom till death, what will we do? I ask myself this question. And my belief is, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but one. And we will fight. And when a nuclear armed country fights to the end, it will have consequences far beyond the borders. It will have consequences for the world, which is why I repeat I'm here. Because I'm warning you, it's not a threat. It's a fair worry that where are we headed? And I've come here to tell the UN, you've got to, this is a test for the United Nations. You are the one who guaranteed the people of Kashmir the right of self-determination. They are suffering because of that. And this is the time. This is the time not to appease like in 1939 appeasement took place. This is the time to take action. And number one action must be that India must lift this inhuman curfew, which has lasted for 55 days. It must free all political prisoners, and especially those 13,000 boys that have been picked up. Parents don't know where they've disappeared. And then the world community must give the people of Kashmir the right of self-determination. Thank you.
En nombre de la Asamblea General agradezco.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I would like to thank His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and I ask protocol to escort His Excellency.
La Asamblea escuchará un discurso.
The Assembly will now hear an address by the Prime Minister of the Hellenic Republic, His Excellency Kyriakos Mitsotakis. May I request protocol to escort His Excellency?
Tengo el gran placer de dar la bienvenida
I have great pleasure in welcoming the Prime Minister of the Hellenic Republic, and I invite him to address the General Assembly.
Mr. President, distinguished heads of state and government, ladies and gentlemen, let me first of all allow me to congratulate Ambassador Bandi on his election as President of the 74th session of the UN General Assembly. It is a great pleasure for me to address the United Nations General Assembly for the first time as the leader of the people who first developed the values that most of the modern world embraces: democracy, individual rights, equal justice under law. For the past decade, however, the story of the Greek people has suffered a series of misfortunes that have tested the will and mettle of our nation. But we struggled, and we persevered. And this past summer, we opened a new chapter in our enduring saga. A chapter that will show once again what we're made of as a people and as a nation. In national elections last July, Greek voters gave my New Democracy Party the support to form a strong majority government and to chart a new course for our country. A course that will build a more productive, more prosperous society, able to offer our people new opportunities to realize their dreams and fulfill their destinies. And we have moved quickly to carry out that mandate.
In less than 3 months, we ended capital controls, initiated measures to spur privatization and attract investment, and passed legislation to cut taxes, open markets, and reduce red tape. And we are just getting started. Mr. President, a new day has dawned in Greece, warmed by the clear light of reason and buoyed by the winds of change and hope. And as we move to steer our country away from the storms that buffeted it for a decade towards calm seas and bright horizons, we remain extremely mindful of our place in the volatile region where we live, in our role, the European Union, whose ideals we aspired, and our responsibilities to the fragile world we all inhabit. And given the multitude of today's challenges and perils, the role of the United Nations needs to constantly evolve, to constantly diversify, in order to remain relevant, to promote freedom, prosperity, and peace in troubled regions. And Greece fully supports the Secretary General's efforts to lead the reforms needed to make the UN more effective. It is indeed time for the UN to enhance its ability to engage in preventive diplomacy, provide humanitarian assistance, to lead both peacemaking and peacekeeping missions, as well as rebuilding shattered nations once conflicts are resolved. And it is crucial to do it all with greater transparency, greater efficiency, and greater accountability. I believe we would all agree that no matter how many peacemaking or peacekeeping operations are deployed in conflict areas, at the end of the day, peace and security cannot prevail in the absence of development and inclusive growth. Greece remains strongly committed to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and to the long-term vision of a climate-neutral European Union by 2050. To achieve these goals, the Greek government has made addressing climate change a core component of its agenda. This is not just a defensive strategy to protect our forests from wildfires and our beaches from erosion and rising sea levels. It's about leveraging our unique natural environment, our unique cultural heritage, as a comparative advantage that will lead to new sustainable growth. And to do so, we plan to adopt a new, ambitious national strategy for energy, environment, and climate before the end of this year. We will ban single-usage plastics across the country by the end of 2021. And we will close all our lignite power plants by the end of 2028. And we will press forward with initiatives to protect our intangible cultural heritage from the impact of adverse climate conditions. We will follow up on the International Summit on the impact of climate change on cultural heritage, which took place last June in Athens, by calling for a high-level meeting next year to continue and expand on the work that began at the Athens conference. Mr. President, for Greece, sustainable development and prosperity are also linked to the effective management of one of today's main challenges, the refugee crisis. Situated at the external borders of the European Union, and therefore at the forefront of the migration and refugee crisis for several years now, Greece continues to be confronted with the biggest migrant and refugee flows to Europe since the Second World War. We rank among the top 4 EU member states in asylum applications and have one of the highest ratios of asylum seekers per capita. And despite the disproportionate burden and the resulting tremendous pressure on our reception and asylum systems, we have managed to save thousands of lives at sea. We're deploying enormous efforts and resources to the best of our abilities in order to host refugees and migrants in a human and decent way, respecting human rights and human dignity of both refugees and migrants arriving in our country. But we are reaching the limits of our ability to address this problem. Entry countries cannot and should not bear the burden of the migratory pressure on their own. Refugee and migration management is a European challenge that calls for collective action, a comprehensive approach, and broad solutions, always based on fair sharing of responsibility and not xenophobic agendas. We need to state the obvious to our European partners. Greece cannot bear alone the burden of massive movements of people fleeing wars of oppression, or simply, as is recently the case, seeking a better future. These people do not have Greece as their final destination. They come to Europe through our union's external borders, which just happen to be our borders. And the plight of these people cannot be turned into a weapon in the service of political goals by anyone, anywhere. The agreement between the European Union and Turkey needs to be respected. And Turkey needs to do much more to fulfill its end of the bargain. The recent drastic increase in the number of migrants crossing the Aegean is unacceptable. Europe needs to continue supporting Turkey financially, recognizing that millions of refugees currently live in Turkey. But at the same time, the European Union needs to move fast to adopt new common rules for asylum seekers that will apply to all countries. No European nation can be a member of the Schengen zone and benefit from the free movement of people while at the same time refusing to participate in burden-sharing arrangements regarding the migration crisis. Because solidarity is not a one-way street. Mr. President, the situation in the Middle East and North Africa represents a source of deep concern, should be addressed by the international community in a comprehensive manner. It is tragic that 8 years after the Syrian crisis erupted, the country continues to be a battlefield, not just for domestic, but also for regional and international divisions, with repercussions felt by all, first and foremost by the ill-fated Syrian people. Greece sees no alternative to a political solution, and we fully support the inclusive political dialogue in Geneva under UN auspices that will produce a framework agreement based on Security Council Resolution 2254, and that will allow not only the return of Syrian refugees to their homeland, but will also provide the basis for the start of the reconstruction of this ravaged country. On Libya, it is imperative to establish the security conditions that will allow the country to heal. And as one of Libya's neighbors, Greece attaches particular importance to international efforts to stabilize the country. And Mr. President, we fully support the UN Action Plan for Libya, as well as the recently announced Triple Action Plan. We believe they constitute a solid roadmap for achieving progress. And as a country that enjoys long-standing ties to the Arab world, but at the same time, excellent relations with Israel, which Greece first recognized when my father was Prime Minister almost 30 years ago, we believe that the Middle East peace process must remain alive and lead to a two-state solution in the hope that one day the area can become a promised land for all its people. Mr. President, it is often stated that geography is destiny. Nevertheless, it is our responsibility to shape our own destiny. And although my country is situated close to an extremely turbulent region, it remains a pillar of stability, actively promoting peace, security, and cooperation. Greece, along with the Republic of Cyprus, has established constructive trilateral schemes of cooperation with Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and consistent with its role as a stabilizing force in the region, a region confronted with grave challenges, Greece remains fully committed to the principles of good neighborly relations with all its neighbors. However, no tangible progress in relations between two neighboring countries can be achieved without full respect for international law, including the international law of the seas, as well as full respect for international treaties. And actions that persistently challenge Greece's sovereignty and sovereign rights in the sea, in the air, undermine the important principles of good neighborly relations. They contravene international law. They seriously impede efforts towards a mutually beneficial relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, 45 years have passed since the illegal Turkish invasion and occupation of over a third of the Republic of Cyprus. An agreed, comprehensive, viable solution in accordance with the United Nations Security Council resolutions should put an end to this injustice. We welcome President Anastasiadis' and Turkish Cypriot leader Akincis' efforts to agree on the terms of reference for the resumption of negotiations to resolve the Cyprus question. It is up to them to decide what is good for their communities, and they don't need any foreign tutelage. And as President Anastasiadis repeated in this hall yesterday, the only acceptable solution is the evolution of the Republic of Cyprus into a bizonal, bicommunal federation with political equality, with single sovereignty, a single international legal representation, and a single citizenship. And Greece is ready to resume negotiations for the termination of the outdated, totally anachronistic 1960 system of guarantees and unilateral rights of intervention and the withdrawal of the Turkish occupation troops from the island. However, Turkey's illegal drilling activities in the Eastern Mediterranean, and particularly